Welcome, everyone. I'm Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual vASN, political scientist at Queen's University in Canada, and I am delighted to introduce and moderate this panel today, the topic of which couldn't be more timely a few days after the Hungarian parliamentary elections that restored faith in all those who have been working for democracy, not only in Hungary, but in all those countries that we've been describing in various terms that combine elements of electoral democracy with the power of authoritarian control, hybrid regimes, competitive authoritarianism, or simply authoritarianism. I'm sure many of you have seen videos about the celebrations on the streets of Budapest on the night of April 12th. Those of us who study regimes will be spending, I'm sure, the next month, maybe years, exploring the key building blocks of that moment, and will be following how the new Hungarian political elite will accomplish the regime change it promised and what Hungarian democracy will look like after those changes. This election speaks directly to the broader questions that motivate this panel, this conversation about populism and nationalism. The basic way in which we define populism is that it sets people against elites, corrupt elites. And clearly, the movement that brought down the Orbán regime in Hungary was an anti-regime movement led by a former incumbent who was able to turn general discontent about an extraordinarily corrupt regime into one powerful electoral bloc in less than 2 years. It brought down a powerful political elite, and it was also a nation building, a nationalist movement led by a charismatic political actor that walked the country for 2 years to mobilize people, carrying the Hungarian flag with him, emphasizing that the Hungarian nation includes all Hungarians, regardless of ideological differences. So clearly, this was an anti-regime, nationalist, and also at the same time Europeanist movement. It's a privilege to introduce our panelists, all of whom are influential scholars in this field. And just to remind, everyone will be following the usual virtual vASN webinar structure. First, each panelist will make a concise presentation, then they will answer questions from our audience attendees, and we are using the Q&A box for questions. So please type your questions in Q&A. Feel free to start sending questions during the presentations. Please do not use the chat box for questions. We use that for showing your participants short biographies and also for literature suggestions, recommendations along the way. So thank you, Bart Bonikovsky, Maria Snegovaya, and Cas Mudde for being here. And we will start with Bart Bonikovsky. He is Associate Professor of Sociology and Politics at New York University. And I'm just going to say that I believe he was in the forefront of research and empirical theory building on ethno-national populism. I'll only highlight his article titled Ethno-Nationalist Populism and the Mobilization of Collective Resentment, which was published in 2017, the title and content of which are directly related to our themes. So the floor is yours, Bart.
Thank you very much, Zsuzsa. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here in such distinguished company with my colleagues. I also scanned the list of attendees. From hello to people that, whom I know well, but also I'm looking forward to chatting with those who I'm yet to meet. So I'll try to be brief. The talk that I'll give, or sort of the introduction I'll give, sets the stage for how I think about how we got here. Which has some implications for maybe how we get out of the current situation, although not in a very straightforward manner at the very least. The starting point is the fact that we know that over the past 30 years plus, actually 40 if you count from the beginning, there's been an increase in the presence of radical right leaders and parties throughout contemporary democracies. It used to be a few democracies, now it's most democracies. The number of negative cases is really dwindling. And of course, we know that the most recent and most perhaps some of the more significant entries into this club have been in the United States, with implications for the world, with the current war in Iran and so forth. And so the question for me has been for a long time is what has contributed to the growth and mainstreaming of radical right politics? I want to make sure that it's clear this is not a linear wave. There are setbacks, and there are, important setbacks, as we just saw in Hungary. Previously, we saw in Poland. But the fact that these parties are mainstream, they're part of our political reality for the time being, and presumably for the long term, I think is quite clear. So how do we get here, and why is this happening in the recent past? Is the question I've been struggling with for a while now. I won't get into a long literature review, but just a couple of things to signal in terms of how these things have been explained in the past. I think we tend to fall into a false dichotomy between economic versus cultural causes. Is it the economy stupid, or is it immigration? And those are kind of the two dominant accounts. And we'll hear very interesting thoughts from Maria on how these two things interact a little bit later. To the degree that culture is discussed, it tends to be reduced to outgroup antipathies, typically to anti-immigrant sentiment in particular. And often there's a conflation of the terms that we use to label these parties and these leaders and this development. And one particular conflation that happens quite often is we call the whole thing populism. But actually, there's a lot more going on here. Populism, to be sure, is an important element, but it is not coterminous with the radical right. And this distinction between populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism is going to be central to what I discuss. And of course, it draws heavily on Cas Mudde's work on this distinction. We also tend to collectively, I think, lean toward monocausal explanations, finding the one single cause that explains all of it. And I want to argue that that's not a successful strategy. And finally, there is this difficulty of how do we account for specific cases that vary widely from one another, and while also being able to provide some broader explanations that really cover the fact that this development is seen everywhere, in across the wide range of very different contemporary democracies. So, to be sure, particularities matter. Right. Without Obama, we probably wouldn't get Trump. Without the Smolensk plane crash in Poland, it would be hard to explain the kind of Russophobic successes of the Peace Party in Poland and so forth. So these are important, but they don't explain the overall pattern that is common across cases. So we have to be thinking about particularities and generalities at the same time. And I think part of the problem here is just kind of a thin way of defining culture. So that's where we've been for a long time, although things are moving quickly in this field, as we all know. I want to propose a model that really places these three distinct elements of radical right politics at the center: populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. Zsuzsa already alluded to what populism is, and we'll hear more about it from Maria in a minute. But basically, the way to think about it is it's a way of doing politics that's predicated on a moral binary distinction between some sort of a corrupt elite and a virtuous people. This exists on the left and on the right. The elites can differ, right? It can be bureaucrats and intellectuals, but it could also be Wall Street fat cats and CEOs. So it's a way of formulating political claims. Authoritarianism is many things, but one of the way I think about it is it's really a way of governing. It's a mode of governance that runs roughshod over liberal democratic norms and institutions. Um, the third concept here that I want to focus on is nationalism. And the way I think about nationalism is quite different from the way that it's been treated in political psychology, for instance. It's not just about chauvinism. It's really how people understand what their nation means to them, which comprises boundaries in terms of who gets to belong legitimately, who doesn't, along race, ethnicity, religion, language, and so forth. It also includes perceptions of the state and pride in the state and the nation and the relationship between those. And also judgments about the role of the nation in the global context, right? And often we think of that as chauvinism. America is the greatest country in the world. We hear quite often from the radical right. And so these three elements all interact with one another. But what I've shown in past work is that the nationalism piece of this is really important because in all countries I've studied, which include most of the cases where the radical right is present these days, there are pronounced and prolonged cleavages around contested definitions of what the nation means. That is, people within the US, within Hungary, within Poland, within all of these countries fundamentally disagree about what their nation means. And those disagreements have become even more pronounced and more politicized, but they've always already been there. So the question really becomes, why is it that these nationalist cleavages become politically salient in certain moments? And I'll get to that in one moment. And so these nationalist cleavages, which are again are quite similar across countries, even though the kind of specific content is different, but the contours, the structure of these cleavages is quite similar. Um, are I would argue the really most potent part of the mobilization of radical right politics. We people have sort of tried to figure out, well, are people becoming more exclusionary over time in these countries? Are they becoming more populist? There is some evidence of that in some places, but actually, for most part, most places are becoming more inclusive in terms of public opinion. So it's not so much that we should be looking at the aggregate trends in these opinions, but rather looking below the surface, looking at how elites combine these elements of populism, nationalism, authoritarianism in new ways, looking at how the views of the electorate polarized by party or by ideology, how old identities like labor and union identities erode in ways that make nationalism more potent, and thinking about why is it that pre-existing claims that have been around for a long time and pre-existing attitudes that have been around for a long time all of a sudden start resonating in new ways in the current historical context. I think that's really where the action is. It's about the shift in resonance and salience rather than just in the presence of these phenomena. Um, and so when these nationalist cleavages are awoken, I argue, is when we get the radical right that we've seen, which has all kinds of nefarious consequences for liberal democracy, the liberal side of liberal democracy, that is rights, equal rights across groups, and the democratic side of liberal democracy, that is electoral institutions, but as well as the autonomy of courts and other important aspects of democratic functioning. And so I'll mention that a little more about that in a second. So the real question then comes back, why has this form of politics been surging? And if I were to give you an answer in a nutshell about how I think about it, it is that these nationalist cleavages that I've described are really the fuel for this form of politics. The anti-elitism and low institutional trust and low pride that is evoked by populist claims is what stokes this fire. And the consequence is tolerance for authoritarian rule. So if you think about the Trump formula, right, it is that your nation, your country is gone. It's not what it used to be. We need to restore it. That's the nationalism piece. Who are we to blame? Elites are to blame, and so are immigrants and minorities with whom those elites are in cahoots with. And so, if you want to get back your country, it may require some exceptional measures, some authoritarian measures, and that's kind of the recipe that we've seen in many, many places. But again, it's the salience of these ideas that is changing, not just their presence per se. So why would these pre-existing frames and pre-existing attitudes resonate in new ways? And I would say the reason for this is just a lot of fundamental structural change and cultural change. A lot of it is real, but some of it is exaggerated, sometimes even fabricated. But what really matters is what people perceive to be true and what they're convinced of to be true in terms of the shifting terrain around them. And so, which changes matter? And I think we should, when we think about this comparatively, the answer is it's not a single thing. It's not, it's all, economic crises. It's all immigration. It actually varies. So even in the US context, there are many reasons why people vote for Trump. And once you look beyond the US, across cases, there's a tremendous amount of variation in terms of what the grievances and what the initial shocks are. So they can include certainly economic crises, deindustrialization and capital mobility. We've seen evidence of this from economists. Trade shocks, we've seen this as well. But also demographic changes, immigration, refugee flows, security shocks, changes in popular culture. Who gets to be prioritized and seen as at the core of the nation? That's certainly changing in many countries. Not to say that in some ways, there's been a wholesale replacement with, let's say, white Hollywood actors with non-white Hollywood actors, but who gets valued and who gets to be seen as the heart of the nation is certainly changing. Social movements in the U.S., particularly around racial justice, but others as well, and certainly in other places, this varies quite a bit. All of these things together create a sense of broad anxiety among majorities that are used to having high status. And so if we think about this kind of schematically, how this then gets mobilized, I'm going to, in a nutshell, give you the model, and then I'll stop and turn it over to Maria. But the way I think about this is that if you think about politics as a set of claims that politicians are making, that's the supply side of politics. And a set of attitudes and beliefs that voters hold, that's the demand side of politics. On both sides, you've got nationalist frames and nationalist beliefs. You've got populist frames and populist beliefs, authoritarian discourse, and to some degree, perhaps authoritarian views in the population. Um, all of these kind of the supply side and demand side phenomena are changing over time. But as I've mentioned, it's not so much that they're changing in the aggregate, it's that there is a lot of churn that's happening. Politicians are experimenting with different ways of combining these frames. And then on the demand side, different identities are changing. You know, labor identities are eroding, nationalist identities are becoming more prevalent, and so forth. And I've done a bunch of work on this that we can talk about in the Q&A. And then you've got these contextual shocks that I've mentioned that are creating a lot of anxiety, a lot of kind of inchoate sense that something is changing. My country is not what my parents' country used to be, and so forth. And what's really important here is that elites who are opportunistic and are trying to pursue political projects are seizing on these anxieties and directing them toward resentment. They're telling people, yes, you should be afraid. All of the things you're worried about are a bundle of shocks that we can blame people for. And the people to blame are elites, minorities, and immigrants. So not only should you be scared, and you should also be angry, and you should be angry at these people, which creates a sense of resentment among groups that are typically have been high status. So in the U.S., it's typically white Christian Americans, but not only. There's also minority groups involved here. But in India, it's Hindu nationalism, right? So who the majority is obviously varies across cases. Once this resentment is activated, it creates a sense of collective status threat among these high status majorities, which then leads to the mobilization of these pre-existing nationalist cleavages that I've described. All of a sudden, nationalism becomes the thing that people are making political decisions on. All of a sudden, returning the nation to its former glory, its particular symbolic boundaries, becomes the project. And that mobilization of nationalist cleavages in my work, I've argued, creates the resonance between pre-existing frames and pre-existing beliefs in new ways, which then leads to successes of radical right parties. The degree of success depends on democratic institutions within specific countries. But the last thing I'll say about this is when these parties start succeeding, this entire model starts diffusing. And it starts diffusing across cases that vary tremendously. So just as one example, Kim Shepley has written about this extensively and really powerfully. Models of authoritarian rule and radical right mobilizations have diffused from places like Turkey to places like Hungary, from Hungary to Poland, certainly the US as well. People like Kaczynski in Poland, Orban in Hungary, fundamentally disagree on many things. You wouldn't catch them in the same room, 20, 30 years earlier, agreeing on things because one is in bed with Putin, the other side is deeply Russophobic, among many other differences. And yet they borrow from each other strategies of mobilization and governance. And this way of of attributing blame to minorities and immigrants, even in the absence of those minorities and immigrants in the countries, in a powerful way. So the point is that the model itself is a model that people learn about across boundaries, across countries, and employ successfully, which is partly why we see a diffusion of this form of politics across very, very different cases. So I know I'm out of time, so I will stop there and not tell you how I've studied this empirically. We can come back to that in the Q&A. So I'll just say thank you. And let's move on to Maria.
Thank you very much, Bart. I'm really impressed by how clearly you were able to give us that account. And I hope you will have the visuals handy in case questions will be coming on the logic of it and the model. And now we'll go to Maria Snegovaya, who is a senior fellow at the Europe-Russia and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I'm just going to mention that I think Maria is doing really inspiring research on how elites and societies, those elites and the people have been adapting to the transformations that have been going on since the 1990s in ways that challenge the common conventional understandings of the political left and right. And her book, published in 2024 by Oxford University Press, provides a really original account on this. It's titled "When Left Moves Right: The Decline of the Left and the Rise of the Populist Right." So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Extremely honored to be in such an esteemed company. So I definitely going to build on many of the points that Bart has mentioned, explaining specifically how the economic shocks and grievances play into the ability of these populist actors to mobilize this sentiment. And of course, we all appeal to the famous definition by our colleague Cas Mudde here, populism that separates between the so-called good people and the corrupt evil elite or others. So almost by default, positioning this deep divide in the society between us and them. And as thin-centered ideology, this approach to this allows populism to combine this particular vision with both left and right appeals. Accordingly, we have a variety of populists on both sides of the political spectrum. Unlike populism, nationalism actually helps explain who are the us in that equation, who are the community of the people who actually are more deserving, are more worthy, the ones that the populists claim to represent. As Bart flagged, there's always the exclusionist element to the nationalist identity, although in its more civic version, it actually allows the possibility of more easy inclusion. So it varies a lot. So the key separation between nationalism and populism, the key topic of today's conversation, is that while populism postulates this explicit divide between the good people and the bad them, nationalism helps understand who the people, the good people, are. And it's famously argued by Muller that populism is always a form of identity politics, given this explicit divide that it postulates, but not in every identity politics is populist. And of course, this divides are particularly important for the populist rights that almost by default are exclusionary when they define the so-called real people. Populist right is also the one that's the most widespread in today's world. Here on the graph demonstrated from the populist data set, the far right and right populists are demonstrated by the blue side. As you can tell, it's the particular prominent type of populism in contemporary world. Now, as Bart has described, there's a variety of various shocks and triggers that actually have been allowing the populist right to politicize identity in the last decades. I will add that specific to the region that I study, as has been mentioned, mostly East Central Europe, post-communist area, on top of all these triggers like globalization, the immigration crisis, silent revolution, the backlash against progressive values, there is also very important building of nationhood project that many of the East Central European countries embarked on following the end of the communism. And that simultaneously triggered two additional stimuli, so to speak. On the one hand, the separation between nationhood and European identification, which is very strongly discussed issue in this context, something that obviously right-wing populists in the region very actively engage with, and memory politics, again, trying to conceive themselves as the nation, but also the nation that has a certain number of symbol myths to appeal for. And last but not the least, the demographic panic is something that's very distinct of the region, given the declining birth rates. Like, for example, in Hungary, this has particularly triggered the fears that we are disappearing as a nation, and hence populist right specifically mobilized the sentiment in an effort to, again, come to power. All of these factors definitely provided right-wing populists with a lot of opportunities to mobilize so-called angry voters, anti-establishment, anti-immigrant, anti-ethnic, anti-Brussels sentiment, blaming those groups and then politicizing and mobilizing support for themselves. However, of course, those have been shocks, but the problem with these explanations is often that while we are able to explain why populism resonates with specific groups in the society, just as Bart excellent presentation has described, it's not the cultural explanations or nationalist explanations alone are not very good at explaining as to when. Since, for example, the explanations are too many, and it's unclear why in Western European context some appeals are more successful than in East Central European context. For example, anti-Roma sentiment has played as a major explanation in post-communist region for the rise of populist right, but not necessarily in Western European context. So why specific groups are being presented as this being excluded in some context than others. Then, despite the fact that often populist right relies on similar platforms across the region, it succeeds in some contexts, but not the others. And hence, we clearly are missing a variable to explain the situation fully. In addition, you'd think that if populist right is so successful at mobilizing anti-immigration or certain chauvinist sentiments, then we should be seeing a corresponding shift in values across societies. But cross-country surveys do not actually demonstrate such a radical cultural and anti-immigrant attitudes shift that these theories would have predicted. So clearly something else is going on. There's also the problem of timing. So, for example, you'd expect that populist right will be particularly successful after the immigration crisis, right, given all these triggers. But specifically in Europe, in post-communist Europe, like in Hungary specifically, Viktor Orban has been an established politician way before. In fact, his illiberal democracy speech, the prominent, notorious speech, dates back to 2014, so long before the migration crisis actually blew up. So clearly, that is not all of the story. And in my book specifically, I focus on this economic side, showing that it actually very often creates preconditions for populists to use this rhetoric to mobilize against specific groups. In particular, the economic side provides two mechanisms. First of all, among the population, on the demand side, it creates demand for protection for so the so-called, often the groups, the so-called economic losers, the ones who find themselves on the losing side of the transition, often low educated, maybe working class groups that have not been able to adjust to the highly transformative trends across the region. They often create this demand for protection, given the dislocation and decline of their socioeconomic status, that creates the preconditions for populists to then appeal to them. In addition, I also show in my book that often mainstream parties adopted very similar economic policies, the so-called economic convergence, and that essentially left only cultural nationalist dimension available for mobilization, for the parties to distinguish among themselves. And that's exactly the opportunity that many populist right parties seized on the supply side. So both demand and supply side in a lot of ways created precondition for nationalist dimension to become more politicized, even if the underlying reasons were economic often. For example, to give you an illustration of that, in the book I discuss specifically the prominent explanation of populist right in Hungary being the result of the ability of Jobbik and Fidesz very successfully mobilized anti-Roma sentiment. Except that somehow in Hungary you see those factors only becoming really significant in the regions which also experience disappearance of the industry, so the so-called Rust Belt. In Hungary, Roma population spread across multiple regions, but it's specifically in the Rust Belt that you see the Jobbik and Fidesz being very successful in mobilizing the anti-Roma rhetoric. Why? As I argued, because very often what you had in those instances is that both groups were left without jobs or had to go to supplement the regional job with some sort of inferior options. And of course, that led a lot of frustration and insecurity that in turn exacerbated the tensions between local Hungarians and ethnic Roma in the region, which in turn then contributed to the escalation that triggered the rise of the populist right, which used these issues to mobilize their support. In a lot of ways, in a similar way, 2015 immigration crisis in Europe, similarly created the opportunity for populist right to mobilize support often appealing to the economic fears that the rise of immigration would intensify. So specifically in post-communist Europe, as I said, first of all, many populist right parties were already popular before the migration crisis hit. And in addition, post-communist Europe did not really experience much of the inflow of migrants. Typically, they would go to the Western European countries. How then were these parties able to successfully mobilize support? The answer is they presented migration as partly an economic issues, because migrants are both economic competitors for local lower income groups, and also create fiscal burden on welfare state, both amplifying the domestic issues, creating the ability for populist right to mobilize support on technical anti-migration issue. And of course, as I show in my book, this is more likely to happen in the countries where left parties sort of abandoned their traditional groups, working class electorates, therefore allowing populist right parties to capture those groups, combining these economic fears with nationalist exclusionary themes. And I show repeatedly that in my experimental surveys, when populist right appeals to those groups on cultural nationalist agenda only, that itself does not shift support. It's only when they combine cultural appeals with economic issues. So why is that? That's because the populist right was to a large extent able to fill in the this bottom left quadrant on this graph, which both combines the nativist and redistributionist appeals precisely where most working class electorates across the region are located. So these are the groups that are more responsive to this sort of rhetoric, and hence populist right very successfully specifically draws support from working class groups, combining redistribution and nativist appeals. So when in power, how do those populist right parties respond to the demands of these groups? Indeed, very often we see that those parties like Fidesz, Law and Justice do tend to incorporate elements of redistributionist policies into their economic platform, specifically protecting domestic business from the so-called impact of multinationals, tariffs, and introducing targeted redistributionist programs for specific social groups. However, as I show in my forthcoming paper with Professor Mitchell Ornstein from University of Pennsylvania, despite the fact that these parties appeal to these groups on partly redistributionist agenda, we actually find that that populist right parties are not consistently redistributionist. In fact, we find very sustainable null effect across multiple populist right parties present in ruling cabinets across Europe since 1990. So despite the fact that they use this rhetoric and definitely appeal to those groups, when in power, they're not necessarily very sustainable populist redistributionist actors of the kind that we see them to be in Latin America. To conclude, altogether, we definitely see populist nationalism ally and complement, but specifically to the extent that national identity, when politicized, definitely help populist actors to come to power, and economic grievances create preconditions for nationalist mobilization, very often serving this necessary element that allow populists to do the trick and mobilize support. And they're definitely mutually reinforcing when economics often creates the demand, and nationalism helps to create the framing of who are the deserving good people that are worthy of the economic support. And I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your consideration.
I just realized that I was muted. I'm sorry. Thank you, Maria. Moving on to Cas Mudde. And his research has really shaped the study of right-wing politics, populism, radicalism. And I think that since his publication of his award-winning book, Populist Radical Right Parties in Europe, many of his definitions have been used in our research, including then his definition of populism. Cas Mudde is currently the Stanley Wade Shelton UGAF Professor of International Affairs, Distinguished Research Professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And the floor is yours, Cas.
Yeah, thank you very much. Delighted to be here together with Bart and Maria, even though here is the cloud space. I will not have a PowerPoint. I want to pick up on a couple of issues which build off in part on things that have also been raised by Bart and by Maria. So two of the things that Bart referred to implicitly, explicitly, are heterogeneity and temporality. And Maria focused on the interaction between concepts, particularly populism and nationalism, as well as the issue of temporality. Right? And so I think that there's an enormous amount of people working on populism, the far right, nationalism, whatever it is. And there is today also a lot of populism and nationalism to study, but we still too often are busy with generic questions. And I think one of the things that is emphasized by both predecessors is this question of why now, right? Because a lot of our theories would explain why the far right is kind of successful always, but they're not always successful, or at least not in elections. So I want to raise 4 different points. First, conceptually, like, what do populism and nationalism have in common? And what explains why they often are conflated. And so populism and nationalism are, to a certain extent, in-group, out-group differentiations. Like they distinguish between an in-group, which is positive, obviously, and out-groups, which are negative. In both cases, I think the out-groups are clearer defined than the us. So you see that in populism, for example, populists devote a lot of attention speaking about who the others are. And the others are generally the elite, are pretty clearly defined. Whereas the people are often defined in relatively trivial terms, like hardworking, honest, whatever. But there's nothing specific about that. Like, everyone thinks that they're hardworking, that they're honest. And so in that way, like, that is something that nationalism also often have. It's often nationalists are very focused on who is not part of it, but they have a hard time defining who is part of the group. And that is also not central, usually, in their rhetoric. The other part that I think is important is that these are not necessarily very stable categories beyond the highest level of abstraction. We see that who is part of the elite or who is part of the people, but also who is part of the nation, changes over time. I mean, the US is one of the best examples. If you look at the Ku Klux Klan, which is itself a broad group of groups, then they started out being white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the South. Those were that was the nation, which then became pretty quickly white Protestants, no longer in the South. And then they became white Christians. And the next step could easily be Christians. For example, initially, Italians and Irish were seen as black, and then they became white. So these categories are, weirdly enough, remarkably flexible. Right? Italy is a very good example under the League. The League's nation initially was Padania, and now it's Italy. Like the FPÖ's initial nation was German, and now it's Austrian. And one of the fascinating things is like it hasn't hurt these parties at all. Like, and so that does, I think, raises a little bit of a question of how important is that in-group? Like, do they really care about being part of the people or being part of the nation, or is this primarily a negative sentiment towards the out-groups? The second issue I think we should think more about is that populism and nationalism are not always combined. We had nationalism without populism in the early 20th century. Most fascisms, while using some populist rhetoric, were ultimately ideologically elitist. And we have populism without nationalism. Think about Southern Europe, think about the radical left in France, Mélenchon, but also Podemos or Syriza. So then the question is, what explains these differences? But I think what's also interesting is what do they tell us about the political context? So why is nationalism primarily combined with populism in the early 21st century, while it was primarily combined with elitism in the early 20th century? And it says something about the kind of hegemonic position of democracy, however ill-defined it is in general. Similarly, why was populism primarily nationalist in the north of Europe, but primarily non-nationalist in the south of Europe? Now you can say, well, that's because it was poor. But in most of Central and Eastern Europe, which is poorer in many ways, it was primarily combined with nationalism. So there are different things there. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. Which goes to the issue, the third point I want to make, is that I think that we should move much more from similarities to differences. So in the 20th century, we often had the problem that we had too few cases of relevant far-right populists, however you want to call them, parties. Right? So we built everyone together. We built the Lisbon Fortuyn and the Progress Party in Norway together with really hardcore nationalist parties, because otherwise we had virtually nothing. There's absolutely no need to do that at the moment. There are more than enough successful far-right parties. We almost have too many, which creates two major challenges. I think the first is, how do we deal with the heterogeneity? Like, I use the term far-right for the combination of populism and nationalism, which is not perfect, and we can talk about that, but for the sake of argument, like, populist nationalism at the moment exists in so many different forms and in so many different levels of success. Like, you have populist nationalists who are in power, who have the majority of the vote or the plurality of the vote. You have populist nationalists who have not even 1%. There's a difference in supply. There's a difference in demand. There's a difference in timing. In certain countries, they emerge decades after others. All of those things are interesting. And I would go even further. I think questions of the far right as a homogeneous group, as a unitary actor, are increasingly uninteresting. It makes it very hard to speak about the far right does something when you have far right who is in power for over a decade, and those who have never seen power. But there is another element that I think is a much bigger challenge today than it was 2 decades ago, and that is boundaries. And so for a very long time, we really have spent some time on definitions, but very little time on classifications. And so we, by and large, have the usual suspects. When we talk about the nationalist or the populist, we throw in certain parties that have always been there, or actors that have always been there. But in many cases, we don't really have a convincing study that show that they meet the criteria that we set. But more importantly, we haven't really done similar types of studies of others. And what counts as a nationalist or a nativist today is different than in the 1980s, 1990s. In the 1980s, 1990s, anyone who was critical about immigration, whatever aspect, was pretty much called a racist party, and no one was debating it. Now you have political parties on the left who have a discourse that is far more nativist than most radical right parties of the 80s, 90s. Think about the Danish Social Democrats. And we don't include them. And this is a major issue. And so I'm involved in the project The Populist with several other colleagues who all have a long history of working on this topic. And we are struggling heavily on some of the major parties, like is the Conservative Party a radical right party or not? And based on what do we make that decision? Obviously, it has massive consequences. If we include parties like the Conservative Party, Likud, the Republican Party into the populist nationalist, then a lot of our models are going to change, right? So I think there are a lot of arguments to be made to take a step back and to see, are our classifications still correct? I'm not in any way arguing that we should conceptually stretch. And this is another thing that we see at the moment. For example, parties like Sweden Democrats and Brothers of Italy are now called conservative, because there are parties that are much more populist and nationalist, right? I think that's the wrong approach. The definition, there's no reason for the definition to change. The fact that we now have more and more parties that are totally normalized, that are populist and nationalist, is actually a very important indicator of the times we're living in. So let me go to the last point, which is also something that Bart raised, which is about country particularities versus global generalizations. Right? And I think both are useful and both have limitations, right? And this goes to, for those of you who do your conceptualization and or are obsessed with Giovanni Sartori, as I am, goes to the issue of the ladder of abstraction, right? If you have a concept that applies to more and more cases, then generally it says less and less about the concept. This is the big problem of country particularities. We have a lot of studies that have very detailed information about one country, but that also describe that in non-comparative terms. And so they're not very useful. Or they bring in all kind of specific, they kind of over-explain the case. But at the same time, we have a lot of global generalizations that get to a level of explanation that's almost trivial, like coming up with explanations of globalization, which is so broad and vague that it just cannot distinguish. All countries face globalization, but not all countries have a successful populist nationalist movement. And so I think we need more focus on the middle level, which by and large just means we need to think much more about scope. And that scope can be regional. For example, Maria's presentation, I think, is very convincing within the scope of Central and Eastern Europe. I think it is more problematic for that model, for example, to explain situation in the US or in the Netherlands or some other countries. But there's also a problem conceptually. Like, so at the moment, for example, we speak about populism, nationalism, or the far right at a global scale, as have I done. But when you look at, for example, Orban 2010 to 2015, roughly 14 maybe, right? Then you might consider him far right, but nativism was not at the core of his agenda in terms of his propaganda. If you look today at the key actors of what is called the far right in Latin America, Bolsonaro, Milei, and Cast, then again, nativism is not central, whereas neoliberalism is central, which is either not central or absent in many other cases. And I think it doesn't bring too much to throw everything together, and certainly not under a term like the far right. I mean, some might be simply right-wing or authoritarian. They're different things. Now, it's also important that the middle level is about scope. So it's not necessarily just regional. Like, it can also be that your theory is relevant within a certain theoretical scope. So, for example, you can do studies where you compare populism, nationalism within presidential systems, compare them to parliamentary systems, or rich countries to non-rich countries. Because often region is kind of it's a non-theoretical category, right? I mean, the fact that you are in East Central Europe doesn't explain something. Like, often it is assumed that that stands for certain things. And so I think that really the way forward in this field is by tackling questions of heterogeneity and temporality. We want to know, like, why does it happen how, but I also want to know, like, why does it happen here but not here? And that is me.
Thank you, Cas. I would like to invite all our panelists back on the screen now. And before turning to questions that I see in the Q&A, let me just highlight a few things that struck me as underlying your presentations. One of them was the question of why now? The other question, why is it now that we have this this wave seemingly of the association between phenomena that we as social scientists don't classify as the same. So nationalism, populism obviously are different concepts, different processes, but why is it that they are associated to such a degree at this particular time? And Bart gave us a logic that was quite appealing, I believe. And then Maria also gave us a very compelling explanation for what is going on, at least in Central and Eastern Europe. And Cas then asked these broader questions about whether even our classifications are correct, and raised the issue of generalizability and also temporality in a way that I think is applicable not only to when we are looking at waves of association between these processes, these phenomena, but also over time. If you look at regions or countries, of how shifts can happen over time, and what drives those changes. And so I just wanted to highlight these, but before turning to more specific questions, I do want to ask Cas about something that he said that is reminiscent of the foundational definition of populism as people versus elites and us versus them. And he said that this is fundamentally about differentiation, as we know, nationalism is as well. It's about boundary making. But Cas, you said that usually the them are more clearly defined than the us. So I wonder how you think about the degree to which this is the case for both populists that are challenging the elites from outside. Think Orban between 2006 and 2010 in Hungary, and incumbent populists. Because in the case of the Orban phenomenon, for example, them shifted quite a bit. So it shifted from the migrants after 2015, when his popularity was obviously declining and his party's popularity was declining. Then it went to it didn't actually shift because these were layered upon each other, remained in place, but people became used to them. They no longer worked. So it was like layering one them, the outside, the enemy, upon the other. So migrants stayed in place, but then the anti-Soros campaign came, and then afterwards Brussels and the LGBTQ community, and so those were the them that were changing, and the us became increasingly more rigidly defined. Those who belonged to the NER system, the system of, how is it translated, national cooperation, I suppose, the Fidesz Orban regime system. So it was even, the us was even institutionalized in a sense. So I wonder how you think about that, the question of us and them, and how it might vary, not only the temporality of it, but also depending on whether the populists are outside or inside the power structure.
So, I mean, my comment was more with regard to ideology and how it's defined ideologically, whereas you, in a sense, talk about it more institutionally. But I think that the us is very often defined by association, as in we who are fighting here together. And ultimately, it is defined ex negativo. It is defined in opposition to someone. Even Orban doesn't spend much time in describing who those people are, outside of the fact that these are the hardworking, honest, trivial terms that say nothing specific about the category. Right? It is mostly those who are associated with me and are against them. Right? And this is the same with nationalism, which is very interesting. You see this now happening in much of Western Europe, like all these countries that are not officially immigration countries, but that have had waves of immigration, but no infrastructure for it. Right? And so we have all tried to set up nationality tests. And in the Netherlands, for example, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands, every single definition of what the Netherlands was, or who the Dutch were, was contested, right? Including by the people who are nationalists. Because again, like the way that people speak about the Dutch nation is mostly in trivial terms, in categories that have nothing specific to the Netherlands. They're just positively associated in the Netherlands, like tolerant and again, hardworking. Right? And so I think, and this goes to a broader issue. I'm pretty skeptical about the use of the term populism. And I think that for it to have any meaning beyond being simply a style that is used by everyone, it has to be rigid, which means that the categories have to be homogeneous. Like if the people in the elite are heterogeneous, then everyone is a populist at one time or another. But also both have to be central. And actually, what you see in a lot of what we call populist is it is mostly anti-establishment sentiment. There are very few references to the people. So the people centrism, again, beyond often when you see it empirically measured, particularly quantitatively, it is actually with proxies, which is like the people. But if the people are not defined homogeneously, then again, these are just regular sayings, right? And so not to argue like that this is all not important, like that but it is in-group out-group differentiation, which doesn't necessarily have to be populist in the confined space, right? But one last point, there's some really interesting new work by groups out of Zurich that that really show that people increasingly now also self-define in terms of this new cleavage of be it winners or losers of modernization or being like outside of inside the system. Again, the categories are actually still very directional, right? It's still much more of I am not one of the insiders, but it's much clearer who the insider is than who the outsider is. The outsider has, in a sense, a negative identity. I hope that's clear, but probably wasn't.
Yes, thank you. So a question that came up in a different form in the Q&A has to do with the inclusiveness and exclusiveness of populism. And I'd like to ask Bart first about this, of how you see, Bart, this question, which is about essentially the example that's used in the question in the Q&A is the Latino population in the US voting essentially for the MAGA movement that uses political rhetoric that speaks against them. So to what extent can we explain the appeal of these exclusivist identity-based movements appeal to people who are being targeted by it?
That's a great question. And just in terms of procedural process, I have answered a couple of questions in the chat, and they seem to disappear from the main list when I do that. It's just I want to make sure that we get to them as well. Volodymyr Kulik's question and Tayeb Cardeniz's question, which are both terrific. On this question, so I don't know if I would agree that the radical right is becoming more inclusive. I don't think, say, in the U.S. example, given that that's what we started with, the way in which ICE has been deployed on the streets of the of U.S. cities and airports, and the ramping up of anti-immigrant detainment and deportation and so forth. I don't think, and certainly the rhetoric hasn't been more inclusive either. But bracketing that for a minute, I think the question of why is it that in the last presidential election, a larger proportion of Latino and Black Americans supported Trump than in the past, and perhaps some people are thinking this may be a realignment of the two parties. I mean, the one thing to say about that has shifted back now, at least in terms of polling. So it seems like it was a temporary move, but nonetheless, it is still an interesting puzzle. And I think what this gets to is that. Ethno-nationalist claims mixed with populism are not the exclusive territory of white Christian Americans, although that is the base, that is the primary audience. But there are a variety of reasons why Latino Americans might vote for a candidate like Trump, despite the fact that seemingly he sort of acts against their interests. One is cultural conservatism, high proportion of traditional Catholics in that population, and some of the issues on which the Republican Party has been running certainly appeal to them. The notion that people who are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants quite often are quite happy to be anti-immigrant themselves and pull up the ladder behind themselves, right? The idea is, well, I'm the good immigrant, but those coming in now are giving us a bad name. They're not doing it the right way, and to protect our status, differentiating yourself from the new immigrants is sometimes a strategy that people kind of, in terms of identities and political preferences, do employ. Um, I've also done some work on this recently as a paper in progress where we show that there's an element of sort of um, a kind of assimilationist logic to this. Like if one way of being truly American is to distance yourself from the immigrant heritage and to basically, show yourself as what is more American than voting for Trump these days, right? In some ways, right? And according to one logic. And so you do see a number of a proportion, still a small proportion, but a proportion of former immigrants supporting Trump in the last election. Um, so I think these are all important mechanisms. One thing that we haven't talked about and did come up in one of the questions is also gender. And this is a hugely gender and sexuality, but gender in particular is a hugely important aspect of radical right mobilization. In Eastern Europe, it's absolutely central, right? In Poland, an idea of gender ideology is the thing that people are resisting, and that goes hand in hand with sort of fundamentalist Catholic nationalism in the U.S. as well. And so the whole anti-woke discourse that is, an assault on racial justice, but also on gender parity and other kind of struggles for equal rights and recognition, that tends to appeal to people who hold more traditional beliefs, who may be more religious. And there's a certain way of which those notions of gender are bundled with ethno-nationalism and a desire to return to some status quo ante, which, of whatever era, let's say 1950s. So I think all of these things are some of the factors that shape the support of minority voters for radical right politics. But again, I do want to say that this is still a very small proportion of the electorate. Most Latinos vote Democratic quite consistently. Most Black voters vote Democratic consistently, and all the evidence points to that shift in the last election receding. Nonetheless, an interesting question. And the last thing I'll say about this is I think the evidence for this was already there in the data a long time ago. So when I wrote a paper that I published with Paul DiMaggio in 2016, where we looked at different types of nationalism, and among those who held ethno-nationalist beliefs and relatively low levels of pride in the nation, there was an overrepresentation of African Americans already at that time. Because a way to gain sort of a sense of recognition and of legitimate status in the United States for a lot of African Americans to say, well, yeah, birth and ancestry really matter for belonging in a nation, right? We've been here for 250 years. Yes, it matters, and that distinguishes Black Americans from a lot of immigrants, and has been a source of tension among those groups in the past as well. So again, it's easy in the shorthand to say, oh, this is all about white Christian nationalism, and that is part of it, and it's perhaps a core of it, but it's not the totality of the support for the radical right.
Thank you, Bart. Did you want to also briefly address the other questions that you already answered
Sure.
in writing?
Yeah, let me pull them up. So the one was about Turkey, and then I've lost the Q&A for now. And then, oh yeah, here it is. And then the other one was about my use of the term Russophobia.
Russophobia,
Both
yes.
very legitimate questions, and I will say both audience members are spot on. I blame time constraints. I had to do things quickly with shorthand. So yeah, Russophobia is a terrible term to capture the full breadth of what's happening in Poland over the last 25 years. But I think what I was referring to there is that the Kaczynski brothers, initially both, now just one, and the Peace Party have long attempted to sow fears among Polish voters of attacks from without and within, of dangers from without and within. So scaring other voters about German aggression and the fact that Germans reclaiming property and looking for reparations in southwestern Poland, that's just the beginning of a German frontier into Poland, of Russia threatening Poland from the east, of all kinds of pressures from within. So not just sort of liberal values run amok, but also Islamophobia and good old Polish anti-Semitism. central to the appeals of peace, right? Never mind that this is Islamophobia in the absence of Muslims and anti-Semitism largely in the absence of Jews in Poland, but these phantom fears nonetheless are really potent, especially when you create a sense of threat from all around. And so this is kind of what I was pointing to with quote unquote Russophobia, whether this is about anti-Russian sentiment or sowing fear of the Russian regime and Russian imperialism. That's a great distinction, and it's a little bit of both, and both have strong long-term currents in Poland. But the point is to just create a sense of anxiety and threat, and basically argue the same thing as I showed in the that schematic diagram. The people who you should be blaming for the entire situation are the current elites in power. Elect us, and we can fix things and bring the nation to where it should be. The second question on Turkey, yeah, there too, a matter of rapid fire presentation. By no means was I suggesting that the Turkish political system is in some ways homologous to what you see in Hungary and Poland. Far from it. I mean, just huge differences and along a whole range of axes of variation. But I think what I was pointing to is the existence of what Kim Shepley calls the authoritarian playbook. The fact that once you seize power, if you're a nationalist, populist, authoritarian party leader, there is a set of steps you can take to very quickly ensure that your power is protected, or at least attempt to do so. So subjugate the autonomy of the media, attack the courts, ideally the Constitution as well, if you can get there. And often, Supreme Courts are a path on that in that direction. Attack intellectuals and universities, and so on and so forth. Right, the civil service. So there is basically a very clear set of steps that we've seen play out in so many different places, precisely that have fundamentally different political institutions, different structural grievances that fueled the radical right in the first place. But the same things that have played out to some degree in Turkey, to some degree in Hungary, to some degree in Poland, and in the United States. Now, do I think that Trump is, reading the authoritarian playbook, so to speak, and studying what Erdogan or Orban? No, the guy doesn't do much research, as we all know. Some of it, his advisors certainly do, and he has had many conversations with these folks. But in some ways, these are kind of emergent ideas that diffuse much more subtly across places, and the same line of attack then is pursued by very different leaders. Now, the difference, I think, that the person who asked the question is that in some ways it's possible that these steps are more reversible in countries that still retain some degree of democratic institutional autonomy and resilience. And so, yes, in Poland, voters in massive numbers, unprecedented numbers, kicked the Law and Justice Party out of power. In Hungary, we saw Orban lose. Exactly what this means and who Orban is being replaced with is a question. It's also the question of how long-lasting these reversals are. And I've been meaning to write a paper on this kind of ratchet effect, where the expectations of the kind of center-right parties that often replace the radical right are so huge. The expectation is you're going to make our lives better, you're going to fix everything, you're going to protect democracy, and you're going to do this all in one single term in office. And inevitably, that leads to massive disappointment, not surprisingly. And then what often happens is the radical right gets brought right back in. And so this kind of thermostatic back and forth that used to happen between the left and the right, both sort of loyal to democratic ideals and values and institutions, but differing on policy. Now it's a ratchet between kind of a democratic party of some sort and a deeply anti-liberal, anti-democratic party. And so it's not really a fair contest. When the radical right comes back, it continues to do the damage and the work that it has done in the previous term. This happened with Orban, right? It was up during the second term that his attack on democracy really took off. It's happened with Trump. It's really the second time in office. And there are many other cases like this. So I do worry, as much as I want to be optimistic, I do worry about what happens when the kind of pro-democratic parties inevitably fail to meet the expectations. But that's a separate question that I went on a tangent about.
Following up on what you were saying, Bart, about these extraordinary expectations of the people from the new elite. I just want to add that the expectation is also then coupled with the expectation to hold the previous ones, the corrupt elites, accountable. And so in some sense, this literature on transitional justice that that we focused on more during the 1990s and comparatively across other regime changes becomes relevant a bit today when we look at these cases like Hungary especially. But it will be interesting to see how then this people versus elites structure, I guess, or logic of populism, for lack of a better umbrella term, is going to also then complicate the problems, the challenges that such governments are going to have. And I'm going to then ask Maria to say give us her thoughts about how left and right feature in this, what they have to do with the relationship between populism and nationalism. I think one of the things that are common across these two are that neither of them have ideological content, right? Both of them can be attached to all kinds of political ideologies, really, and that's how we talk about them in the literature about nationalism too. That it's not a proper political ideology in that sense, and populism is not either. So, how does left and right feature in this, and also to what extent is this movement of the left to the right that you talked about specific to the post-communist countries that came out of a state socialist kind of regime where where the elites did not have the kind of massive oligarchic economic power that, for example, the Orban regime acquired and made possible for its cronies.
And if possible, I'd also like to take a couple of questions that ask about Erdogan and Putin, since Putin is almost my default topic. So absolutely. So left and right, first of all, I couldn't agree more with Cas's comment that this is all very regional and context specific, right? We do definitely see common trends, but it's very important to see that to flag the specific shape they take is definitely framed by context. And to your question on left and right, I would flag, especially with comparison, when comparing the dynamic in post-communist Europe with Southern Europe that Cas flagged, and also Latin America. What is distinct? So there, in these regions, we've seen this reaction to largely the same processes, like Washington Consensus in Latin America, for example, policies coming from the left. To me, at least one of the explanations is certainly the legacies of the region, right? In the context of post-communist Europe, the left legacy is often tainted. You can't argue with Slovakia's case, but in general, it's much easier to accumulate and be a challenger on the right. That's one of the reasons why, as Bart has just discussed, we see in both Poland and Hungary, the politics increasingly like leaning right, and the main competition now ongoing on the right, partly because of the communist legacy that's so tainted. But of course, there's also the problem that I flagged in the book is that many of the policies against which the backlash is ongoing, like specifically the reforms, were implemented by the very left parties, which traditionally are the ones that cater to the losers. So populist right saw the opportunity and they seized the momentum. In Slovakia, that did not happen because Fico was a very shrewd political animal, and he was able to see that opportunity when his left party, originally the left centrist party, was implementing the reform. So effectively, he defected and created his own successful left challenger. So that is at least part of the story, even if, of course, I'm sure there's more to that. So the legacies play an important role. It's much easier to be a challenger on the left if you are in Latin America opposition party than it is in Hungary or Poland these days. But I also wanted to flag that on top of these questions, it's important to engage with a question about relationship between democracy and populism. And I think it also helps us understand somewhat the differences between the case of Russia, Hungary, and Turkey. First of all, I'm very kind of happy that in Hungary we have seen this relatively really peaceful transition, partly because I actually anticipated it, given that Hungary is really not Turkey and it's not Russia, right? Well, the populism of the post-communist version of it is fundamentally a democratic phenomenon. From where I come from, we have a paper about it forthcoming with, again, Sveta Petrova, my colleague from Columbia University, where we show that populist voters, supporters of Fidesz and law and justice, they do embrace the key tenets of electoral democracy, which is exactly what we've seen in Hungary. However, they're not liberals. That does not mean they're liberals. In fact, they're illiberals. By default, we call them majoritarians. They do reject checks and balances on constraints on popular will. And to a large extent, that's exactly what we have seen in both contexts too. Of course, then scholars typically start engaging to what extent rejecting liberal tenets of democracy is fully rejecting democracy, and that is a completely valid question. But in general, we have seen that to the extent that populist is a democratic response to some of the problems with liberalism, that's exactly how it played out in Hungary and earlier in case of Poland. A common counter-argument to this would be, but hey, Turkey is not in European Union, and one of the reasons why it was much easier for the incumbent to hold on to power, right? It's much harder it is to imagine for this to happen in the EU context. However, that is not what most analysts was saying before April 12th Hungarian election. Many anticipated that Orban will pull it off either way. And second, I will flag that Hungary is both in the EU and achieving some rotation of democracy for this democratic rotation for the same reason, is that significant chunk of the electorates, even those who support populist parties, still subscribe to the key elements of democracy, such as rotation in power. And so that's exactly the inspiration that also brought these countries into the European Union in the first place. The economic factors definitely played a significant role in Orban losing support. He promised to deliver alternative successful model, the liberal democratic model that would also cater to economic grievances of his supporters. In reality, after 2022, he failed to do that despite increasing dependence on Russia tremendously and despite mobilizing using the same rhetoric, exclusionary rhetoric, where, as has been discussed, the enemies were now Ukrainians, and Zelensky in particular, just as he did in 2022, he lost support because people no longer subscribed to that as long as the economic model was no longer delivering. In case of Turkey, the difference was, at least to the extent that I understand it, I'm not a Turkey expert and I should flag this, is that Erdogan did not lose his base to the extent that Orban lost, right? Orban primarily lost his own constituencies, often outside of Budapest, that he was able to successfully mobilize in the past. In case of Turkey, my understanding that did not happen, and this is something to look into. And last point about Putin versus Hungary versus populist actors in post-communist Europe. There's parallels, but there are differences. Putin is not populist to the extent that you understand populism as a democratic response to the problems that liberalism created. But he is a reaction to the very similar issues created by political and economic liberalism in Russia, as Orban is also a reaction to these problems created by liberalism, political and economic liberalism in Hungary. But and from that perspective, I think they fundamentally represent a very similar phenomenon, but in a very different institutional context with very different societies, where in Hungarian context, the society is fundamentally embracing democratic tenets, while in Russia, that is not the case. Institutions are highly authoritarian. But the parallels are definitely there to the extent that it is a reaction against the transition and the dislocations that are associated to the economic transition, and of course also political elements of political liberalism, which these largely conservative societies are reluctant to accept. But, and I'm going to end with this, one reason why I was actually much more hopeful about Turkey for a while, since I was in Budapest last time in last summer, and CEU, which was, as we know, basically pushed out of Hungary. I was actually presenting in a beautiful building CEU have managed to retain in the center of Budapest, which unfortunately no longer as actively engaged, but nonetheless they're holding to it. They're organizing plenty of events there, despite all the tensions with the Orban regime that we know of. This would have never happened in Russia, right? In Russia, if a university is done, it's totally disappears, and the beautiful, very luxurious, like beautiful asset that is the building is instantly expropriated by the state, right? So for all the unfortunate trends that we observed in Hungary, this was to me an indicator that things are not as bad as we were afraid.
Thank you. We have less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to thank our panelists very much and ask them to say anything that they really want to add at the end of this conversation. And I will also remind our audience that of two things. First, that I'd like you to stay tuned because we are also going to organize a conversation about the Hungarian elections specifically, and that the ASN convention at Columbia University will take place in late May, May 26th, I believe, am I right, to 28th. And I hope that many of you are planning to be there. So let's go in the same order. I will ask Bart first, and then Maria, and then Cas.
Just wrap up by saying that I just greatly enjoyed hearing Maria and Cas's presentations, all really spot on, and as always, raising more questions for us to ponder. Cas has always had, in particular, really interesting interventions in terms of how to think about the next wave of research on the topic, and I agree with everything you were saying. And these are tricky things to study at scale. How to think about particularity versus universal explanations. How to think about regional differences, and I think Maria's research, as Cas pointed out, is really an exemplar for how to think about this problem regionally. So if we had more time, we could talk about how does this differ in Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, from Southern Europe, from the US, and so forth. But we don't have that time. So what I will say is just that the thing that I think Zsuzsa, you mentioned at some point, and others in our preparation for this talk is, where do we go from here? And that's where I will say I have no answers whatsoever because that's not what I'm an expert in. But I do think we should be thinking about what can be done to not so much turn back the tide. I really do think that the parties we're discussing are here to stay, but how to minimize the damage, the long-term damage that is done to our institutions, while also addressing some of the very real problems that these parties are responding to. And as I mentioned in my previous comments, this is a really tall order. People in the US are struggling with this as much as people elsewhere. I think in the US, the system is just far more fragile than we had ever thought. Many of the things that we thought are laws are just norms. And it turns out if you are sufficiently charismatic in your own way, in a very particular way, and you decide to just disregard those norms, there isn't much that anyone can do about it, especially once you've already co-opted an entire party, and once they've hitched their wagons to you, right? So I think there is this question we're in the point in the U.S. history in particular, where I think that there are many signs of sort of optimistic future trajectories in some ways, right? So the Republican Party is terribly unpopular. Pretty much every single policy the Trump administration is pursuing is unpopular. The war in Iran is equally unpopular, and if anything, it has all kinds of knock-on consequences that are deeply hurting people, inflation, gas prices, et cetera, et cetera. It also has been showing even further than before Trump's endless hypocrisy. So there is a possibility, maybe even a good chance that Democrats will win the next midterm election, and that fills many people with hope, in some degrees, to some degree, me as well. But then what, right? And how do we proceed in a way that protects the institutions that we still have, that ensures that the people who are voting for somebody like Trump do feel like their views are also represented in the political system without necessarily undermining the institutions in the long run? How do you make people's lives better while also shoring up the liberal democratic system that we have? And all of that is just talking about domestic politics. In terms of international politics, I'm not sure there is a going back from where we've ended up anytime soon. And so I think this is a big question, and I struggle with it because I'm studying the antecedents and the causes, but I'm not sure exactly how they translate into future solutions. And to some degree, when I talk about these things, people want to know, okay, well, what should Democrats do? And so we can talk about ideas of electoral strategy, but that's only step one. And it seems to me that if anything, the next election, maybe even two, are the Democrats to lose. So the electoral strategy is maybe not the most important thing to talk about. It's if you regain power, what do you do? How do you act like a party that is actually fighting to save the system in some ways while also reforming its problems, rather than what the Democrats have been for a long time, which is kind of a gerontocracy, party of the establishment that is completely unprepared for the current moment. So I'm talking about the U.S. because in some ways it's it's the big elephant in the room, and it's in many ways does set the tone for politics beyond its borders. And so again, no answers, many questions, and I think this is sort of the challenge for our time. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on it, but that's where I will end.
Thank you, Bart. I just want to add that one of the good things coming out of this is that the US is becoming part of the world of comparative politics. And so American political scientists and sociologists and social scientists generally have started to actually place themselves within a world in which many of these questions have been studied. And so
It's taken long enough,
welcome
hasn't
them
it?
to
I
the
mean, it was
stage.
shocking that in 2016 they had nothing to say.
Right. So Maria, floor is yours.
Fascinating. By the way, I want to flag that, Cas, I'm a big fan of your avatar. I really love it. Now, I totally obviously echo everything that Bart said. The phenomenon we don't fully grasp as yet, partly because it's extremely opportunistic. And I think to the question that's been asked in the audience, is us always unified? Indeed, I would flag it is always unified, but that's only because the them is so fluid. Like literally everybody can be them, and one of us who was there yesterday can tomorrow instantly become them. So, and this is the unique ability of this part is to really like fluctuate and adapt this term. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why in my research I focused on economy. I was just extremely frustrated with all this nationalist exclusionary rhetoric that can present anything, literally any phenomenon, like Ukrainians in case of Hungary, as them. That is a completely fascinating, but certainly highly like the phenomenon that will keep requiring our attention for years to come. That's no question. And I just wanted to go back to that point about the democratic nature of populism. I think there is an element, there's a tendency in the scholarship to sort of ostracize populism for all the right reasons, because it's highly problematic obviously for democracy. The illiberal nature is extremely dangerous and bad. But also, as you can tell, there are some healthy elements of it. First of all, there is often a reaction to some objective problems that exist that political liberalism has ignored. And second, ultimately, Hungary and Poland give us hope that at least to date, the response continue to be within the framework of democratic institutions. I think as we think about the response to this phenomenon that unfortunately is here to stay with us, we might want to engage more with these democratic elements of it, and rather than just picturing it's highly authoritarian and evil, maybe try appealing to this particular element, emphasizing the democratic elements more, and trying to showcase the importance of democracy for these voters, accordingly, essentially using this tool against them going forward. So this would be my call for the scholars that are engaging with this phenomenon going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Cas.
Well, we're already out of time, so I will point two things out. That one I'm busy with theoretically. I think we should be more focused on negativity in two ways. So first of all, the context of the 21st century is increasingly a context of pessimism, which is a very logical context given that the 21st century is the century of crises. And that creates a very different mood. And I think the US is one of the best examples. Like when I moved here in 2018, all of my students were positive. They had this naive American optimism, which was one of the few things I liked about this country. It's gone. It's completely gone. Like, I mean, the students are pessimistic. And when you think like that you live in a period where things are going to be hard, they're not going to be better. You're going to be inward looking. Your solidarity is going to be smaller. All those type of things, right? I think it has meta-theoretical theoretical consequences. The second, which is particularly problematic for democracy, which is undersold, is we live in a time of negative voting increasingly. And Magyar is a very good example of that. Like in a proportional system, Magyar would have had what, 20%, maybe 15% of the vote. Because a vast majority of people who voted for Magyar are actually not as conservative as Magyar. The vast majority of people who have voted for Macron have voted against Le Pen, not for Macron. In the US, for presidential election after presidential election, we have a contest between two people who are massively unpopular, right? And so most people now vote because they dislike the other. And whereas we have all these theories about the cult of personality of Trump and all these kind of things, but your average Trump voter votes against the Democrats. Now, the question is, why do they have this warped view of the Democrats? Like, why do they think that if you tell them that, well, it was the president of peace and America first, and he's invading Iran, that people will then say, well, but the Democrats would do this or that, right? And then you can say about Fox and social media, but again, the reality is that most people are actually not busy with these type of things. Most people are not watching Fox the whole time. Most people are not on social media the whole time. But somehow, like, they have a view of an outside force that is warped, but is very much driving what they do. The second thing, which I think is the most exciting thing about Magyar, and I also try to still celebrate this and not become like skeptical too quick. Magyar has surprised me in how he has, from pretty much moment one, spoken about institutional reform. I love the way he does it, straight in the face of people. Like his interview on state TV was just absolutely classic. But this is a massive change from particularly Biden, like, who was totally not ready for the moment, but the whole Democratic Party wasn't there. But even Tusk, like, I mean, who should have been ready, because Tusk is a much more seasoned politician in that way. And Tusk was also not really ready. But this is really the question for more and more countries. Like, what do you do with India after the BJP? Like, you see even Lula struggling, a very seasoned politician with a large party behind him. What do you do with Brazil? Because voting out is not difficult, right? Because everyone is negative. Right? But transforming that and protecting a system without making it look like you do that out of self-interest, I think that's the thing. And there is so little attention to this. There's so little attention to how do we strengthen democracy? How do we create institutions that, like, in a sense, are easier to protect? Because institutions can't protect themselves, right? They have to be protected by people. But what I think you see at the moment, one of the reasons why so few people are protecting the institutions, is because many people in politics and in the media do not fully understand what liberal democracy is, or why certain institutions are important beyond their own self-interest. And so I think that's one of the big challenges, right? Is actually to get out of this reactive sphere where you are just better at negative politics and create a better understanding of what the system is that we have always defended, which is liberal democracy, after all.
And maybe creating space again for different sources of information, different kinds of information, and also bringing back research. The Hungarian case shows how important that is, and professionalism in the academic sphere. I think that we can end on a somewhat happy note there, or positive, if not happy, at least positive note, that there's need for the kind of work that you guys are doing, and And hopefully it will also translate more into information to the public beyond our students and your students. So thank you very much, everyone. And see you back next time. Take care.
Thank you for having us.
Bye, everyone. It's good to see you.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.